get in and get settled virtually. Right. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Amy Bryan. I am a co-director of the MacArthur Justice Center's Missouri office, and MacArthur Justice Center is one of the hosts for this webinar this evening, along with Missouri Prison Reform and the NAACP of Missouri. We're really excited to have.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
We are excited to have a really great and diverse panel of folks to talk with everyone tonight about how to prepare for a parole release hearing. And this, webinar was really an idea that folks, some of whom are on the panel tonight, some of whom are in the background, wanted to put together after getting lots of questions from people who are incarcerated or their loved ones on the outside about how to prepare for a parole release hearing, how to navigate that process, how to set their loved one up for success, and support them in the best way possible. So that's what we're here to talk about tonight. Just a few housekeeping things before we get started. We're gonna start the evening with an overview of the parole process. We have with us tonight the chairman of the Missouri Parole Board, Tony Helfrecht, and hopefully I got your last.
Yeah, you did great. You did great.
Thanks, Tony. Really grateful for you joining us tonight at the end of surely a long day of hearings and other work.
No, thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here and excited. So yeah, thanks again, Amy.
Great. Yeah, so in a little bit, Tony will give an overview of the parole review process. Some folks sent questions in advance and we've passed those on to Tony, so thank you for doing that. If you have other questions, there is a question and answer function, and you can send questions to me or the other panelists or to the hosts, and we'll do our best to answer those throughout the evening. We also, about 7:30, we'll have a moderated discussion with other panelists who I'll introduce later. And then we'll make sure that we have plenty of time at the end, starting at about 8 o'clock for questions, other questions that y'all might have for any of us. This is being recorded, and just so that we can make it available to other people who weren't able to join us this evening. And Tony has graciously agreed to step out for the question and answer portion at the very end, to address any privacy concerns that folks might have. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Tony, who is, as I said, the chairman of the Missouri Parole Board, appointed to the Parole Board in February this year, I believe, by Governor Parson. And so he's going to give us an overview of what the parole process looks like in Missouri.
Tony? Okay, great. Once again, thanks for having me here. I'm excited to be here. I want everyone to succeed in parole hearings. And in fact, whenever we have parole hearings, I usually say that to who I'm having a hearing with. Quite frankly, it's one of the biggest days of their lives. And everyone on the board, all of our analysts, everyone involved wants them to succeed. So I'll vaguely kind of tell you how we do things. Obviously, well before I became chairman or part of the board, we traveled to the facilities and met face to face with who we were having hearings with. I think it was around COVID that all changed, and it changed a lot of things for us throughout the state. So now we are virtual. We're from our office in Jeff City, and we have virtual hearings. Now today, Amy was at a hearing that we had to actually do at the facility. Was that at JCCC or was that Algoa?
It was at JCCC.
Okay. Our internet broke down, so the local facilities there, we were able to get our staff there and have a hearing, and Amy was there. I've only done that a couple of times since I've been on the board, and I like doing them in person, but our funding isn't where we can travel throughout the state. It would create quite an expense. So Amy gave me some questions or some topics to talk about today. And number one, and I've already said this, we want everyone set up for success. And you might say, well, what's set up for success? So most people understand that they're going to have a parole hearing. I'd say 3, 4, 5 months from the time it happens. You usually try to schedule that well in advance. So what can we do? Well, number one, um, we look at conduct, and hopefully, um, if we've had conduct issues in the past, you find out you have a parole hearing in 3 or 4 months. Hopefully, folks realize that, and it's really important to clean that up. Um, we look at during the hearing, I look at honesty quite personally. We have all the information about what happened, why we're ultimately having this parole hearing today, the charges, what's accused. Um, and you know what? Honesty goes a long way. Knowing the past and being accountable for the past. That's huge. And like I said, we have all that information in front of us, and it's pretty apparent when someone's kind of not exactly being, upfront. I'm not going to say dishonest, but not letting everything out or not explaining everything as we're asking. Parole hearings are hard. We ask a lot of questions. And you know what? A part of that is just to see where we are at in the rehabilitation process. We understand that to grow and, you know, to be successful, we have to account for our past. And a lot of people are, and we definitely appreciate that. Also, another thing we look at is what have you been doing in your time while you've been incarcerated? Are you not doing anything, or are you active and in treatments or in programs or taking courses? All that just looks really, really good for an individual at a parole hearing. Um, you know what? I think I had one today that the person did like 20 different courses and restorative justice hours and that person has taken advantage of the situation and wants to grow as a person and succeed in life. And we look at that very closely. And also, it's okay to show us your personality during a parole hearing. Folks come in and we understand, oh my gosh, it's got to be nerve-wracking. When I first started having hearings with folks, I was nervous. But a lot of our folks, a lot of our offenders have waited years for this day. And we understand that. It's nervous. Some of them come in there and you can tell they didn't get a good night's sleep. And they'll tell you that I did not sleep good last night. I take that into consideration. I understand, but it's also okay to show us who you are, your personality. It's okay to smile and every once in a while, it's okay to crack a joke. It's okay. Um, but like I said, I look at a lot of things, and I'm one board member. We have 7 very unique individuals, all with different backgrounds. I have a prior law enforcement history. So what I consider, you know, violent or this was awful, someone else might not consider that. And that's okay. That's why there's 7 unique individuals on the board. Um, so we look at a lot of things like that. Um, Going over some other stuff that we prepared for tonight, you know, just adding on to how to prepare for the hearing. We look at, case by case. Um, every case isn't the same, and you have to take that in consideration. The seriousness of the charges or the crimes, that's case by case. It's not everything's the same. Um, I was in law enforcement for almost 25 years, and I thought I'd seen and heard everything. I haven't seen or heard anything. I came into this position and you realize, a lot a lot of these charges that you see are the title of, robbery or theft, but the seriousness and what happened, they're all different, and we take that case by case. Um, just some of the other things. I got, institutional behavior, offender change, being remorseful, realizing what's happened in past past transgressions and moving on and having a great home plan. That was another thing that was a question that I received. And it says here, if an inmate has a strong support system, how far does that get taken in consideration? I can tell you that's one of the most important things we look at. We want folks, once they do get released, to go to a great home plan. I don't know if that's a family or a friend or a wife or mom and dad. Transitional center, we want the best possible plan for that person at that time. And we understand, a lot of folks get released and they don't really take the home plan as serious as they should, and they end up back running around with some of the past friends, and unfortunately, that's not the best place for them. We want them to succeed. Um, so yeah, home plan's very important to us. Um, Thinking about what you want to do um, for a job when you get out. I mean, that's important. You need structure. You need to have a good career. A lot of folks don't have driver's license when they get out. So once folks get a release date, the facility can actually help them start getting their driver's license, reinstated. That's really important. Folks need to get out and earn a living, and we don't want to be restricted by not having a driver's license. Mom and dad or wife can't always drive, to your job for you. So, that's really important. Your IPO can assist with your transitional housing, finding you a place. They're great. And a lot of the things that, the IPO can help you with might not happen until you do get that release date. And then things start coming into view there. And ultimately, we understand a release plan or a release date kind of opens up what the IPO and the facility can do for your out plan.
That was a question I had as you were talking, Tony, was is it okay if somebody says sort of, I want to go back to St. Louis or Columbia, but doesn't yet know like concretely where they're going to be because they don't have that out date yet and they haven't been able to apply to programs?
Right. Sure. If home's Columbia, but they don't have are you saying like a release date itself or
Yeah, because some programs you have to have a release date in order to like apply. For example, Criminal Justice Ministries, I think in St. Louis is like that. So they might want to go to St. Louis and do the release to rent program, but they can't say officially they've been
yeah,
accepted yet.
totally fine. And we understand what that shows us is they're thinking about it and they're putting a plan forward in their head. And that's ultimately what we want. That's huge with us. Have a plan. We understand that you can't exactly put everything in the process without a release date, but folks come into these hearings and they'll print off every certificate that they have earned while they've been incarcerated. And they're very proud of it. And I'm proud for them. They've done a lot of work and they're wanting to share with us what they have accomplished. And you can feel really good when they show you that and they have a plan for release. It just adds to the whole thing that we're looking at, that we know that, they're going to be successful upon release.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about like how you balance the seriousness of the offense with some of those actions people take, programming or treatment, as you mentioned, or maybe even having like a good work history, how that kind of balances with the crime itself?
You know, as I stated earlier, 7 board members, we all have different views on, serious crimes. Um, You got to balance it. Absolutely. But we look at it case by case, and that's the way you have to do it. Not everyone, you shouldn't lump everything into one category. Everyone, and we use fact-based research, analysis, in our decision making. Um, but with that said, the seriousness of the crime, when you talk to someone in a hearing, it's apparent if they've, I can't quite describe it, but you can tell when they talk about the past and where they want to go in the future. You can tell if the lights clicked and everything's come together and they're ready for the chance upon release. And like I said, every case, every hearings, the what I think of a seriousness of a crime, other board members might not think the same. But if I'm in the hearing, obviously, once I have the hearing with the individual and our analyst with me, uh, it's always going to go to majority board vote. So at least, until we have a majority, all the board members are going to read everything. They can listen to the entire hearing, um, look at the criminal history, see what the, serious offense was, how old they were at the time of the offense. That's huge. Um, I had one today that the young man was 17 when the offense occurred, and it was not good, but just so much growth that individual has made since this offense had occurred. And I told him that. Um, I said, sir, you arrived, and don't take this the wrong way. You arrived as a boy and you turned into a man really quickly in this institution. And he has succeeded. He has completed program after program, and I was so proud of him. And that's not just one. Every day we have folks that have accomplished so much. So you just got to take, the seriousness of the crime and compare it to their age, their conduct, the programming, the treatments they've done, and just take all that in consideration and use the best common sense that you have as a person to try to make the best decision for that individual and the community as well.
Thank you. And I'm sorry if I interrupted you, but I had questions and I assumed other folks did too. So
Yeah, no worries.
you mentioned that decisions are majority board decisions. Are
Mhm.
there ever decisions that are made by the full board, or are they all majority?
Okay, so any hearing that we have, if that parole board member wants to take it to the entire full board, they can. Now, that doesn't always happen, and quite frankly, it doesn't happen a lot. Now, the entire board will vote on executive clemencies, medical paroles, things of that nature. Um, but in terms of full board, just a regular parole hearing, not very often. It's a majority. Now then, with that said, we keep the integrity intact. And by that I mean every 6 months, okay, we all have offices and we're all lined up in the same hallway. And say that I have the hearing and it's my hearing that I have. Well, all my files go to the next person to my right for 6 months. And their background is completely different than mine. Their political affiliation, is different than mine, and we go in the same order for 6 months. Now, after the end of 6 months, we go in the exact opposite order. And if they're there or not, it doesn't matter. The file will go on their shelf and wait for them to come back from whatever days off they have. So we keep the integrity going. It's not like, oh, I know Mr. Harden's going to side with me, so I'm going to Mr. Harden. I have him. No, none of that. So we are proud that we keep our integrity intact.
And so can you talk a little bit about, what to expect at the hearing itself? And then afterward, like, do you get a decision at the hearing or does it come later?
Okay, so the decision at the hearing, if it's a nonviolent offense, and the patrol or the parole panel, the hearing panel, which comprises of one board member, one hearing analyst, parole analyst, and the institutional parole officer. That's what's considered a parole hearing. So we have three folks on each hearing. For nonviolent offenses, if we all agree, and has everyone heard of ORAS, the guidelines? Okay. If we all agree that, okay, this person can be released within the guidelines of the Ohio Risk Assessment, we can finalize that, just the parole hearing panel. Now, if we go below or if we go above, we can't finalize that. And keep in mind, that's non-violent offenses. Um, so if we go above or below the ORAS on a non-violent offense, we would take it to majority vote. Now, violent offenses, the hearing panel cannot make final. That will go to majority board vote. Just in terms of hearing itself, I'll walk you through it. So it's my hearing. Um, the IPO, the institutional parole officer, will go out, and usually all of our offenders are in about the same area, and say it's Mr. Smith's term to come in. So Mr. Smith will walk in, and I will introduce Mr. Smith to myself, my parole analyst, and the institutional parole officer, who they probably already know anyway. Um, and I, ask about, especially if it's their first time before the board. Say, sir, I don't know you. I'd like to get to know you. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me how far you made it in school. Tell me if you're married. And that kind of breaks the ice. And, you can start a conversation about kids or wives or work. That's, and it kind of gets it going. And it's casual. And like I said, it's okay to show your personality. I actually really enjoy that because it is a big day. It's a big day for me. It's a big day for you. So after we talk about, how you grew up, any issues, juvenile issues or anything, I'll ask that question. I'll usually ask about the current offenses, why we're here today. And like I said, we have all the information in front of us, either on a computer or paper. And I just ask, sir, in your words, can you describe what took place on, this date during this offense? And, you know, um, let them talk. Um, After that, we usually talk about, okay, thanks for acknowledging past aggressions. Let's talk about the future. You know, um, what's your home plan? Where do you plan on living? What do you plan on doing? Do you have a driver's license? Can we help you get that driver's license? If they're struggled with addiction, sir, have you had any treatment for your addiction? Would you like treatment? Do you think you need treatment for drugs or alcohol or anger management? Because while you're here, we would like you, we would like to give you any programming you would like to have. Um, so that's always an option. And I want to know if they want treatment. Now, sometimes they don't want it, and we as a board decide this person's, had addiction issues. We really want them to get treated before we release them back in the community because we don't want them to come back. And we think for their good, they could use some treatment or they could use some programming. I usually ask about conduct, keeping in mind I have any or all conduct violations in front of me. Ask them what day-to-day life is and what do you do every day there? Are you reading? Are you working? Do you have a job? Um, and it usually takes, I'd say, a typical parole hearing, 20, 30 minutes, depending, give or take some. Um, we have, and one of the questions was, can you have a delegate? Absolutely, you can have a delegate with you there at the facility. Now, one of the questions was that Amy sent me was, how many can you have? It's only one, but we encourage anyone else to write letters, send us emails. We upload all that into what we call file bound, and it's right next to all the reports where I said I can look at conduct, I can look at criminal histories. Well, all letters of support are in there as well. So hopefully at the end of 20 to 30 minutes, I got a pretty good idea of who I'm talking to. And we go over everything, man. Some of these questions are really difficult to ask. But in terms of me or in terms of the board looking at rehabilitation, you know, we have to ask those questions to see what the answer is. And like I said, I think it's positive for everybody. Um, so yeah, that's a typical parole hearing, Amy.
Thank you. And then one last question, I guess. How
Yeah,
soon after a hearing can someone expect to get a decision?
sure. So it can range a little bit, but not much. I usually say in my parole hearing, sir, you'll get an answer from us back in about 2 or 3 weeks. Keeping in mind, it might be 1 week, it might be 3 weeks, but usually 2 to 3 weeks, they should have an answer.
Right. And then if someone had just asked a question about if the delegate's an attorney, which does happen. So I was a delegate today.
Yeah,
You know, what do you as a board member sort of see the role of that attorney being? Is it any different than a typical delegate?
I don't think so. Not at all. No, you're there to support, you're there to help, you're there to represent. So that's what a delegate is. There to support, there to assist. I don't think so. I don't think it's any different than, a family member.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's great. And we'll continue the discussion. We're just going to open it up now to the full
Sure.
panel, but thank you so much, Tony, for taking.
Yeah, sorry I talked a lot, but hopefully I said some decent things there, and anything else you can ask, no worries. I'll answer my best.
Great, great. Well, thank you. Stick around for a
Yeah.
little bit then if you're willing.
Okay. Yeah.
And hey, let me see if I can share. I'm gonna just introduce the rest of our panelists who are with us tonight. And I'll put their bios up on the screen here. So we've got three other folks who are going to be joining the conversation now for the next half hour or so. Victoria Thompson, who is as a community occupational therapist at St. Louis University, and serves those transitioning and currently incarcerated in prisons and jails by providing occupational therapy services, which aim for a holistic approach to teach individuals how to navigate the changing world around them in areas like health management, employment, and financial management. And I know Victoria and her team at the Otis program have worked with a lot of our clients who are returning residents to help them reintegrate back into the community with success. So really grateful to have her here to share her expertise. We also have Sheena Eastburn, who is wears many hats. She was sentenced to life without parole as a juvenile and actually was incarcerated in Missouri for 25 years until a change in the law afforded her the opportunity for parole. And she has really taken that opportunity and made the most of it. Since she's been out, she's founded two grassroots organizations, Show Me Justice for All and Prep for Release, through which she works with people who are going through the parole process, exiting prison, helps them prepare for that and prepare for reintegration into society. And then last but not least, we've got Melanie Crocker, who has worked for more than 10 years as a probation and parole officer in Missouri. Some of that time spent as what's called an institutional parole officer, which folks heard Tony mention earlier, the parole officer who works at a specific correctional institution with folks there on their parole hearings and requirements or expectations when they get that out date and preparing them for release. So this is the panel we've got today. I'm going to start with a first question to Melanie, if that's okay, because Tony gave us such a helpful overview of the parole hearing process. But for those of us who work with clients or loved ones on the inside, we know it kind of starts before you even step foot in that room with this sort of pre-hearing interview that happens with the institutional parole officer. Could you kind of talk about when that happens and what that looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. Generally, we are, as an institutional officer, they will get a report, usually, like Tony said, 3 to 4 months ahead of time to let the IPO, institutional parole officer, know that this individual is getting ready to be scheduled for a hearing. And then we will schedule the time to meet with the client to complete the ORAS, Ohio Risk Assessment, to gather more information. And it's also a time for the institutional officer to get to know that individual, and actually just kind of talk to them and to give them an overview of what they can expect in the parole hearing, especially for those who have never appeared before the board before and they're completely unknown. In my time as an IPO, when I met with the individuals to help them prepare for the hearing, and Tony touched on this a little bit, I always recommended they be as candid as possible with the parole board. Force yourself to challenge your self morals and don't listen to other individuals who've been before the board, because it is 100% case by case. And it can be a real challenge for a lot of the individuals to put themselves first, because usually in their life they have not. They'll put family, friends, associates first. And it's really forcing them to say, this is your time to, in essence, make your plea for release. You're asking the parole board to grant you a release from inside the institution. So it's your time to share with them honestly and openly, why now? Why not at potentially your conditional release date? Or if you're past your conditional release date, your maximum release date. Why should they give it to you right now? And that's only a question that individual can truly answer. And then when they appear for their parole hearing, to give that information. And I have seen it firsthand, and Tony hit it spot on. You kind of pick up a knack when you're speaking to an individual and you're not saying they're being dishonest. They're just not providing all of the information that you really need to help make the best informed decision. And some of that, in talking to the individuals, can be they're afraid. There's this fear that if they are open and honest, that it would hurt against them. And I was a huge advocate for it's the actual opposite. If you are trying to hide something, they're going to know. The parole board will see that. I can't tell you how, but they can sense it. So having to encourage and provide validation to an individual for them to try and overcome that fear can be very difficult, but it's just through that encouragement of, what have you been doing while you've been here? What have you done to make yourself the best version possible? So when you are released, that you're carrying all that momentum forward.
And can you talk then, so you do the interview with that individual,
Mhm.
and then what do you do with the information that you gather during that discussion with them?
All of that is, I guess the best way to kind of describe it, it's put into a very nice formal report that has kind of flows with all the information for the parole board. So that way, when they are at their hearing, they have all of that information. The criminal history is in there, our interview, as far as, school, work, home life, associates, substance use, any mental health concerns or diagnoses, all, and of course, conduct I was a huge person for conduct violations. I would open every one of them and discuss them with the individual and go, what's going on here? You got a conduct violation for hanging your clothes on the window. You know, you're not supposed to do that. Come on now. And just going through them to hope that they will see that even though they may be small things, they are an important piece of the puzzle. And all of that goes into that parole hearing. And then once we have compiled all of that information, and also we calculate the guidelines based off of their ORAS assessment, and we provide that kind of like time frame, that all was presented to the board. So then the day of the hearing, that packet of information is all together and it's easy for the board member to locate.
Great. So, and my sort of sense is that that part of the process is really important, because, you know, that's sort of the board's first impression often of the individual who's going up for parole. I think that's really helpful to hear. What about, and this I can throw to you, Sheena, there are instances where we get a lot of questions like, how should I talk about the crime with the parole board? You know, especially if you know the victim might be present, you know, you want to be open and honest, but you also don't want to re-traumatize them. And then what further complicate things, there are instances where people have innocence claims and they know, you know, that the board wants to hear accountability, but they also, you know, didn't commit the crime. And so how do you balance that? How do you, you know, what guidance do you have for people on how to talk about the crime?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, but I think number one, if you're really remorseful for what you've done and have taken accountability, and you have worked on yourself while you're in the institution, having that conversation is always difficult. It doesn't matter who's in front of you. Having a conversation that I committed this crime can be difficult to admit, yes, I did it. But one, victims want to have accountability. So taking accountability and responsibility for your crime is the number one thing that you have to do, not only for the parole board, but for yourself. Right. So I think that it's really hard when you're preparing for a parole hearing, I think the best thing to do is look at yourself and you know that you don't want to do anything like this again. You don't want to reoffend. So how do I make sure that's not going to happen? And if you can answer that question to yourself, then you can answer it to the parole board and into your parole institution, your parole officer. Innocence claims is a lot harder because here's a file that says you did this. So that's when you go in the parole hearing and you say, you know, I am in court, you know, I am still filing, or I'm filing that I am innocent. And you still tell that part because you still should be able to say that and not say I'm guilty. But just like you and I could sit in a room, I can tell if you're BSing me or if you're not. And so I think that the main thing is if you're innocent, stand on your innocence. Don't take accountability because you think it's going to get you a parole date. Stand on your innocence and continue to fight for that. But if you have committed a crime, I think the best thing for yourself and for victims is, and it's not even about the parole board, it's about your growth and accepting accountability. And that is the best thing you can do for yourself and for the victims that have been hurt by your decisions.
Sheena, yeah, I saw lots of nodding heads of agreement. And Tony, actually, that reminds me of one thing we didn't talk about, which is victim participation. And I answered a question in the Q&A just by chat. I just wanted to make sure that I got it right, that my understanding is that the victims have a right to participate in the parole process. And can you talk maybe just briefly about what that might look like?
Sure. So we have a whole kind of division within P&P for victim services. So basically, anytime an offender is scheduled for a parole hearing, it will hit in our computer system, and victim services get it, and they reach out to the victims saying, offender Smith has a parole hearing on this day, and ask if they want to attend. Whereas the offender can only have one delegate present, we can have several victims during a hearing. So keep that in mind. But yeah, they get, I would say in a given week, just me, I would probably have at least 3 or 4 victims hearings where the victims are actually with us or at the facility during the hearing. So if you multiply that by 7, because there's 7 board members, we have lots of victims that attend these hearings. It's tough. It's very tough. And I get totally what Sheena said about you don't want to upset the victims, but the victims also know what happened and they're prepared. I can tell you that. They're most of them are prepared. Um, and like Sheena said, Melanie as well, just accountability. That's huge. That's huge. And those are really tough. You can't get used to that because most of the time, it's either a really bad incident or there's a death involved and lots of tears and lots of anger still. Uh, we understand that side, but we also understand, accountability on your side. And as Sheena said, to find out who you are as a person, how you have, kind of changed and where you're going in growth. It's best to always, say, exactly kind of what happened and just be honest, be truthful, honest, and as open as possible.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that I suggest to my clients who are going up for parole is, if they are going to have a family member or friend be their delegate, like let their delegate know what to expect, that there might be a discussion of the crime, that there might be victim representation,
Yeah.
so that they can kind of, they're not caught off guard by what can be often like a very emotional, interview or a statement read by the victim representation. So,
Well stated. And also I'll add to that, um, if the offender's conduct, certain conduct violations, because a lot of family members attend, and we will bring up certain conduct violations, have them prepared for that as well.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. What about the instance where, I mean, we talked about programming, and I was thinking about how a lot of my clients have been juvenile lifers who are sort of last in line for waiting lists for programs. So does the board take that into account, like the access that there may or may not be for programs at different institutions or based off of their different sentence structure?
We understand that, absolutely. A lot of the folks, like in reception or diagnostics, we know that they're not going to get the proper classes or treatment or at that point, and we're aware of that. They might have been in a diagnostic facility for, going on a year, and it says, well, they haven't completed any programming. Well, we know why. They're being, diagnosed. Where are they going to go after this, and so forth. So we understand that there could be a gap in, accomplishing things. Absolutely. No worries with that at all. We're aware of that.
Okay. And then I think there was a similar question about if someone's in protective custody or ADSEG and has the same barriers to programming.
Yeah.
That's something the board kind
Totally understand. Yep. That's just, yeah,
of. Okay.
absolutely. Take all that into consideration.
Okay. There were a few questions about delegates that I just want to flag before turning to Victoria with some reentry questions. I mean, one is sort of questions about who might be a better delegate, a family member or a counselor. I know that sometimes folks ask me that question, like, is it better to have an attorney there or a family member? And then are there people who can be denied to be a delegate? Someone mentioned that she was denied being their husband's delegate like a week before the hearing, and wasn't sure why that had happened.
So I wish I could answer that aspect. That's going to be at the facility. I don't know. But in terms of picking which delegate, I think in the back of your mind, if you have, a question on who should I pick, who do you trust, who's going to be there with you through thick and thin, supporting you. Um, you know, basically to represent you because they do. The delegate represents the offender, and we allow, and I didn't get into this, but we allow the delegate to talk if they so wish. And we take what they say very seriously. In fact, we always wait till the end. A delegate can't really speak until the very end of the hearing. And I make reference. I was like, just you being here supporting your son or your husband shows the board how much you love or support him. If you'd like to make a statement at this time on his support or of your support for him, please do so at this time. And we take that very seriously because we know, a lot of these folks have not, they've been incarcerated for years. It's a different world. They don't have a driver's license. They don't have a place to live. They need a job where they're going to be relying on the delegate right there. And most of the time, their delegate, I've got him a job, got a place to live, got a car for him, things like that. That's huge with us. So, that's a tough question on who, if you have several options to be a delegate, just try to pick the one person that above anyone else you can depend on. You can rely on this guy or this person, this woman, to be your, just be your lifeline when you do get released.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
We've got lots of other questions. I'm gonna save them for when we turn to Q&A in a little bit because I want to make sure to get Victoria Thompson plugged into the conversation. And hoping you can kind of give some tips about how to prepare a reentry plan. That was something that Tony mentioned is really important, very important for success, not just getting a date, but being successful when you get out. And I know that y'all have worked with a lot of our clients and getting them successfully reintegrated into their communities. So can you talk a little bit about how someone goes about preparing for reentry?
Yes, absolutely, Amy. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this. So making a reentry plan or a transition document is a service that I've worked with Amy and other people recently on to prepare for parole hearings. It's something that we've been hired out to do, me and my coworkers as occupational therapists. And I just wanted to put a little plug in for occupational therapy, if you give me a moment. Just to kind of mention what the distinct value is of using OT services is that we specialize in adapting and modifying tasks to teach independence with individuals when they are in the community to support reentry. So the most of the work I do is with individuals once they get in the community, but that's lent me a lot of experience to kind of talk about that process to help you guys kind of prepare for that journey. So I just wanted to share some information on how to do that on your own. And I'm going to go ahead and screen share at this moment. I made a handout that Amy will give to everyone, so please don't feel like you have to write this down. Can you guys see this document?
I can.
Okay, awesome. So, like I said, this was going to be emailed out afterwards. And so this is just kind of some areas that we like to highlight when we're thinking about making a parole document for someone. If I'm doing the research and helping create the plan that's explaining their story. And so we do an interview and get all this information. But if you're doing it on your own, it's really just start by thinking about your goals. Where do you see yourself in 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, and kind of think about that generally, and then start to get really specific, talking about all of those things that Tony mentioned, your home plan, what's going on. I've written many times in there, like individual plans to apply for CJM housing, pending approval, that will be their primary plan. Secondary plan is to live with their parents. And, I think that's a good way to kind of describe those things. I know that came up earlier. Driving community mobility, mentioning, what resources are available to you, what is going to be readily available, and what you need to seek out. And so I've kind of dive in with a little more specifics on driving, financial management, health management, education, work. And all of this kind of comes back to the idea that we know you have a lot of goals when you get in the community and it can be overwhelming. So taking time to kind of identify these steps can really help support you feeling like you're in charge when you get there because you know what's going on. And that's what we want for everybody is to feel like they have a plan and they know the steps to the plan. So it can be helpful to even look up and identify resources in the area, especially if you're thinking, I don't have someone to help me. Then there's usually people in transition centers at facilities that I know can help do some research to identify other places if you don't have that family support. I know we've been talking a lot about social support, and that is something I have down here. It's kind of some additional topics. I know this is a long list to be writing out, so I have these as kind of optional. This is something you could add in if you wanted to talk about meal preparation, shopping, nutrition, if this is something that's important to you that you have a lot of experience about. Obviously, if you're going to go live with a family unit or become a parent, you should probably talk about what you're planning to do with that, but it's not relevant to everyone. Technology, I think, is a commonly underestimated challenge for individuals because if you are someone who's been incarcerated for a long time, you may not have a lot of smartphone experience. Technology is constantly evolving. I learn new things about technology every day, and it's hard to keep up with. So it's just good to know what is going to be in your area and where you can go to seek out those if you don't have family members to help teach you and kind of show you the ropes of everything. And commenting on spirituality, leisure, and social participation. I did technically put social participation down here as a recommended topic, but I should probably put this at the top. I think this is really essential and for people to keep in mind because we want to know what you're going to do and who you're going to be relying on and what your social network is. Because you are, potentially going to be interacting with individuals that you were involved with before, and that could be something that the parole board is concerned about you getting mixed up in things that they don't want you to reassociate with. So you want to be clear and, not hide things. If you, have made plans to distinguish yourself and move into a new group of people, or if you're still communicating with the old people, but they're not a bad influence, those are great things that I think to share and kind of these kind of experiences. And then I just have a little information here if you'd like to email for clarifying questions or stuff later. So I don't want to take up too much time. I know there's a lot of questions and things to say, and I could talk about this for hours. But I hope this kind of gives an overview of what I think should be in your transition plan and some starting points on how to kind of write this out and define it. And again, this is going to be emailed to everyone afterwards.
No, that's really great, Victoria. I'm wondering if you have looking at this list, I could see if I were locked up for 20 years, being a little overwhelmed at how do I get experience with money and budgeting if I've never had a credit card or bank account? And do you have sort of advice for how to start developing this, developing a reentry plan, maybe where to start? Because I could imagine it being pretty overwhelming for some folks, not for everyone, of course, because folks are different, but.
Yeah, there's actually this really cool website called Start Here. It's actually for St. Louis, and it does identify different resources, and that's typically where I will start with everything, and it breaks things down in those same categories that I had listed before. And so typically we're just going to start by doing some research on the computer, but I highly recommend people connect with their public libraries and talk with librarians because they're usually really connected in the area and know all the free resources. And, it's free to go to the library, it's free to print, it's free to type your stuff there. And there's people that'll answer your questions there for free too. So it's usually a pretty good thing. I highly recommend just getting on the phone with someone, like someone at a library or someone like me or someone like Amy, and finding a connection because typically you're going to bounce from person to person and they're going to help you find the next place to go as long as you're open and friendly and willing to, ask what you're looking for. If it's financial management, I know there's an organization called Justine Peterson that helps in St. Louis with people building credit. They help teach them and kind of build up the ropes to that. And there's something for everyone. You just gotta be ready to ask for it and be willing to call or follow up in person and, kind of reach out and seek that place.
Yeah, I appreciate the library plug because that's when I always make, and I just put into the chat a link to the Kansas City Public Library website because they have a whole community resource desk. And I know that these are, there are a lot more resources in the more urban pockets of the state. So sometimes it takes a little bit more work and research to find resources down in the Boot Heel or in Joplin, but they're there. And Sheena just put in a a plug in the chat that she helps in rural areas. I know that the MacArthur Justice Center, we don't have social workers, but we're plugged into networks that provide resources for folks who are transitioning, and always happy to connect people with services wherever we can. So thank you so much, Victoria. Appreciate it. We are at the 8 o'clock mark somehow already. I know we've got a lot of questions unanswered. Before I kindly kick you out, Tony, I wondered if I'm just going to check some of the questions, because they might be specific to the parole board, about why family members can't participate by Zoom for parole hearings. I know that travel can be an impediment for some folks. If you're in St. Louis and your loved one is incarcerated, like in Cameron or St. Joe, it's quite a haul. And so are there ever going to be options for virtual participation for family members?
You know what, with something we've never discussed, and we're not on Zoom. It's and I'm not a techie person whatsoever, but this is more in depth than Zoom, and I wish I could explain more, but I can't. It's a great point. I get the point. I just don't know if maybe in the future, but right now we have never discussed anything to that nature.
Sounds like a great opportunity for folks to advocate to the parole board, if that's something that you
Sure, absolutely, absolutely. And like I said though, and I get the Zoom, but letters of support, we see them all. And we strongly urge the letters of support. So please don't think that, oh, we get these, and no, that's not the case.
and I'll
So
say,
please keep them coming.
I'm sure that being an attorney in hearing room probably changes how the hearing goes, for better or for worse, but I have been going to parole hearings for over 8 years now, and I have seen a shift I have to give credit where credit is due, even though I'm being recorded. But I have noticed a significant shift in terms of the time that is being given to my clients in the hearing, and also that it's apparent that when we submit materials in advance that they've been read, and that they're informing the questions. That was not happening 8 years ago.
Hey, the last 2 emails you sent me about certain clients, I have emailed them on and I have printed them off and given them to folks. We have all of the information, and we do that for everybody. So yeah, as I stated earlier, it's a huge day, and I'm new to the board. But I know everyone deserves this. Everyone deserves a parole hearing, and they deserve to be heard and given utmost respect. And as long as I'm here, which who knows how long I'll be here, but as long as I'm here, everyone's going to get that. And I promise you, we're going to do everything we can for our offenders to have a good, very respectful, and have their voices heard. Amy.
Well, thank you again, Tony, for joining us. And
Yeah.
your questions at the end of the night that we're not able to answer without you, maybe we'll follow up by email again.
You have my email. Nice to meet everybody. Thanks again for including me. Anything I can do in the future, please reach out.
Thanks, Tony.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Night. All right, folks. So we're gonna sort of switch gears only slightly to a question and answer portion. Let's see. We're still recording, but Tony has left the room, so hopefully folks feel a little bit more comfortable. But you can also submit questions anonymously if you're more comfortable that way. I just want to sort of re-up that idea of allowing folks to participate in hearings virtually. I think that would be wonderful. And so if that's something that would benefit your family, encourage you to just reach out to the parole board. Their email addresses, I believe, are on their website. And so you can email them and just say this would be, I'd love to attend and show my support for my loved one, but I can't be there for whatever reason, and encourage them to consider that. And the video feed is internal. Okay. well, I'm sure they could figure it. There's a way. Again, I'm not the person to solve this tech problem, but I encourage folks to advocate for it. Let me pull up some of the other questions here. Let's see, yes, I'll put my contact information in the chat. Some of the, this question may be for Sheena or Melanie. There's a question about like, if you come to the hearing and you don't know who the parole board member is going to be on your hearing panel until you step foot into the room and they make the introduction.
Mhm.
What if it happens to be someone that you or your loved one has like a relationship with, good or bad, in the past? Is that something that you should address?
Well, as an institutional officer, when the list comes down, like we can tell the offender, your hearing is scheduled for this day. As far as what board members and or analysts are actually going to be present, that's not like when I worked at Algoa. When I was at Algoa, I had no idea what board member or what analyst was doing hearings on what days. Now, the central office, they have individuals that, if there is, say, a conflict of interest, if there's been anything identified from a board member or an analyst that they're a relative of this individual, that is flagged beforehand. That board member analyst is at that institution doing that parole hearing for that individual that day, if that makes sense. Like they're ready to do that. Now, if it is something.
Uh-oh, looks like we might have lost Melanie mid.
Here.
Okay.
Sorry. But if it's something that the board member that they're not aware of a relation or acquaintance, and the individual at the delegate or the offender, then yes, by all means, say something. Like I'm not comfortable doing my hearing right now with this individual because of this, or this. With the board members doing the majority of hearings remotely through the video feed, there can be another board member available that they can just switch. So that way that individual can still have their hearing that day. They're not like, oh my gosh, well now I have to wait another 6 weeks, 7 weeks to get one. They can do a quick switch.
If there is somebody on the parole board that my family knew extensively in a layout background, though, I would actually make sure that my family called and said, hey, can we make arrangement before my parole hearing? Because, Joe Schmo knows me and my family, and I feel like this could be biased or whatever. And then that way, I think it keeps the parole board integrity, but it also is letting them know that that person does not need to be in the decision making of the majority.
Great. Thank you both. It looked like I was distracted. It was because I'm trying to download some files to share with folks. One of the questions was, what should I put in my letter of support? And we at the MacArthur Justice Center, we have a couple sort of handouts that give guidance to delegates about what to put in the letter, and also how to prepare for a hearing. So I'm just going to share those in the chat once I can figure out how to do that. Let's see. If there's another question about like if a parole board member has personal experience with a similar crime and could be biased, are they required to recuse themselves? I'm not aware of any recusal requirements like that. Yeah, and most of the parole board are either former law enforcement officers or former state representatives. So that, of course, is going to kind of color their experience and their perspective. That being said, we've had many clients who've gotten outdates and they've had hearings in front of Republican, former sheriffs. And so I wouldn't totally write it off as being a good outcome if you end up going in front of somebody who's got, a law enforcement background or experience, maybe being a survivor of a similar crime, that they don't have to recuse themselves, but there's some comfort, I suppose, in knowing that there's a majority board decision and they're not going to be the sort of final decision maker.
Yeah. Oh, I seen a question on there. Sorry.
Go ahead.
It's the parole decision made off victims' emotions and words or offenders' accountability and rehabilitation. I will say for my parole hearing, my victims did speak against me and I still got paroled. They know that victims are hurting. They know that they're going to say things, but they did take account of my accountability and my what I'd done to reform myself. I think over that because they already knew that the victims were going to feel the way they did. So I think that once again, case by case basis, and I went in front of a different parole board 7 years ago. This board seems to sound like they're a little different than the one I went in front of. But I think that going in, parole boards do know that the victims, how they already feel. What they want to know is what have I done to be different so that I make sure I never make a victim again.
Yeah. And I've also been in many hearings where there's been victim representation and sometimes very strong opposition, and our client has still gotten a release date. So it's a factor, but it's not insurmountable by any means.
I am one of them people.
And there are also some instances, although these are less common in my experience, where there's victim support for release. So that's always a possibility. But I think if somebody has a really great institutional record and has demonstrated their readiness for release, I think that would overcome victim opposition. A question about how many parole hearings each year. So the parole board, I think, conducts about 15,000 hearings each year. Is that right, Melanie? Correct me if I'm wrong, but
that is pretty accurate. I mean, there's a lot. And as Tony mentioned, just like with the sending the file on for the majority, they're all on a rotating schedule, and they also rotate analysts. So with one board member and one analyst maybe conducting hearings for Farmington one week, they can be conducting hearings for St. Joe the next week. So they're not at the same institutions, and it's not always the same mixture of the parole board and analysts. They're like constantly changed, and it's just kind of almost like a lottery, so to speak, of this is going to be who's here and this is going to be who is here. But they also do have that scheduling to get them done. So if board members are out of the office, whether it be for training or personal reasons, then the hearings will still go on.
Yeah. And, sort of the second part of that question was like, how do they review all that material? I know it's a lot. So those 15,000 hearings, they're not all parole release hearings, right? And that's what we're talking about tonight, but they also review files for clemency, medical parole, alleged parole violations. So that's when someone is out on supervision and accused of violating one or more of their conditions of supervision. And this is a teaser for we're hoping in the future to have a separate webinar in that issue specifically, because it's sort of a whole different complicated environment to navigate. Once you're out, how do you stay out, and what happens if you slip up? So we'll talk about that in the future. But they've got a lot of 7 board members. The way that they split it up, they do a ton of hearings. And they often review that material in advance or that morning before the hearings start. I will say that the hearings also seem to be a little longer than they were when I first started doing them 8 years ago, when they would sometimes be like 5 or 10 minutes. I was kind of counting today when I was sitting watching some other folks go up, including folks without delegates, and they were in there 20 minutes or so, which, you know, doesn't seem like a lot of time, but it's a lot more than what they used to be spending. And a lot of that information is really succinctly summarized in those pre-hearing reports that Melanie was talking about, so that they have it right at their fingertips. But it's also, I think, really one of the reasons it's important to kind of prepare for that hearing, because, you know, you kind of only have a little bit of time. So you want to make sure, sometimes I tell my clients, make a checklist of like, what are the key things that you want to get across in this hearing? And maybe even bring that with you, because you might be nervous and you might forget. But then if you can look down and see, oh, I didn't mention that I did the ITC program, or I didn't mention that I'm like in phase 5 of this, you know, substance abuse program. Like you know, you can mention that to make sure the board knows that, even if they've read everything, you know, it's sometimes bears repeating, and it'll make it stick in their mind a little bit more, because, you know, they are only human and they're not going to remember everything they read, even if they did prepare really fully for the hearing. Sheena, there was a question that I wondered if you might have special insight on, given your experience both incarcerated and also working with folks who've been in like, you know, longer sentences, about this like term institutionalized, and whether there are sort of additional resources for folks who've been inside for 20 years or more.
You know, I came home 7 years ago and there were no resources. And so, yes, we are part of one of those resources. That's what Prep for Release does, is we do help everybody, but I do like to concentrate on people who have done longer term sentences. It's a different type of reentry, mentally, preparing the family for reentry as well is very important. My family wasn't prepared for me. So we come home to a different world. Like if we've been incarcerated for 20 years, the world has changed a lot. So we Prep for Release, one of the things that we do as a resource is we help find counseling, different type of jobs that may be needed, that different. We also work on preparing you before you come home, what that's really like. What the challenges and the differences is going to be, because it is a lot different coming home after 20 years than it is 5 years, 6 months. It's a big difference. So my focus is to help with long-term post incarceration is a real thing. And so I think that people need to know that you need to prepare yourself mentally after release, because you can't come home.
And I think, I mean, I'm so impressed with all the work you do, but I really especially appreciate the Prep for Release work, because I often feel like I have inadequate training and experience to help my clients navigate that. So that for them to like have the expertise of someone who's been through it and knows what it's like, you know, I think is invaluable. So that's, I guess the other thing is relying on your network of other folks who, you know, have gone home and been successful, or, you know, family and friends, not being afraid to ask for help and lean on those support networks is important.
And we want to help families and people incarcerated, because a lot of times I think people go to the Parole Board, the family needs to be prepared too. So what's going to happen? And so we try to prepare not just the person incarcerated, but also the family member that's going to be a delegate. And if they can't get a delegate, we are okay being parole advocates and going to hearings for people as well.
That's awesome. You know, there are a lot of folks who go up without any support, and I think having somebody in the room is so important for them. But also, you know, there's a saying that injustices happen in empty courtrooms, and I feel the same about parole hearings, that,
Yeah.
you know, it's so important to have people in those, because otherwise they're closed proceedings. So that pre-hearing report that we were talking about, you know, folks don't have access to that, just the board and parole staff. And so the hearing room, you can just have your one delegate, but that's it. It's, you know, you don't get access to the recording. Some states, they're publicly accessible. Some states they're live streamed. Some states they're open to the media, but it's pretty closed in Missouri. And so, you know, the more we can kind of be in those spaces and show that we're paying attention, and also that we care about the people that are going up for parole, I think the better the outcomes will be.
And definitely the loved ones, the ones, if you're, you tell your loved ones, really talk to the IPO because they're going to put stuff in your file that a 30-minute hearing can't get done. Because you can take a 2-hour hearing with the institutional parole officer, but you only get 20 or 30 minutes with the parole board. So if there's things that you think the parole board really needs to know and you may not get it out at the hearing, try to give it to that IPO, even if it's writing a letter yourself to the parole board before you go, so that they can actually read your words and then they could ask you about it.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's great advice. There's one more question in the chat about substance use in prison. And Melanie, I wonder if this is something that you have insight into. And then if Victoria, if you want to jump in on maybe talking, if you have any advice for sort of navigating recovery and reentry. I don't know if that's something that you folks with. Sorry to put you on the spot, but Melanie, like, does the board consider substance use? And do you have any insight into like how that weighs into decisions and whether it's acknowledged as a disability, even if it's, getting them caught up in conduct violations?
Substance use is part of the ORAS, the Ohio Risk Assessment. So there is a section in that pre-hearing report that it's a larger version than, like Sheena said, that the parole board, when you're in that hearing, that they're really going to discuss. As far as the pre-hearing report, the individual is asked, when is the first time you were exposed to illegal substances? At what age and in what capacity? So kind of that individual's whole life with experience as it's related to substance use is included in that, as well as if someone has been into treatment. How many times have you been in treatment? It's always been kind of I guess I wouldn't necessarily say an unwritten rule, but for every individual who has a history of substance use disorder, there will be a minimum of 7 attempts at treatment before they're successful in their recovery. And so as an institutional officer, and as a field officer, we recognize that. And so does the board. So we ask about your recovery attempts. How long was the longest period that you were able to remain sober? And all of that is provided. So the board looks at that. Were you under the influence of anything when this current offense occurred? How long was the individual on a 5 or 6 day bench, or had they been sober and then they relapsed, and then during their relapse, that's when the offense occurred? All of that is gathered for that pre-hearing report. But when Tony kind of mentioned, there are some conduct violations that are heavily discussed. Substance use inside of an institution is one of them. And that's where it kind of goes back to being that open and honest. I've had experience where an individual has tested positive. They used while inside the institution, and the institutional officer also has to interview on that type of a conduct violation to prepare a special report to the parole board to inform them, because that can affect a release date. And it's asking me, and I've had individuals say, well, I just kind of got caught up, and that's kind of their rationale for it. Well, that information is provided to the board. And that can weigh on then either during the hearing or potential of an adjustment of a release date, because it's not fiction, it's fact that there are drugs inside of prisons. that if you are in an area where other individuals are using and you become involved in that same type of activity, but yet there may be 100 other individuals in that wing or in that housing unit that have not engaged in it. They want to know the reason. Why did you choose to partake in it? So yeah, that weighs a lot into it. And it's, utilizing the inside resources of, can you walk away? Can you say, this isn't for me, and just leave?
And the only other thing I'll add is that I think my sense, and I don't know, because I am in the position of, advocate and suing the Parole Board in the past. But my my suspicion is that it's relevant in terms of what your release date will be, what they might expect of you when you get out. And so they might say, well, if you're struggling with substance use, we'll give you an out date, but we're going to set it out a couple years and we want you to stay clean, or we want you to go and do this recovery program. And then probably a condition of your parole supervision will be, of course, it will be sobriety. It's a typical one, no drugs, no alcohol, but they might also ask that you participate in, some sort of substance use programming, as well as the condition of your parole. So I don't know that I've seen it as a barrier to getting an out date, but more as, just another kind of thing that's weighed by the board and informs their decision of when you might get an out date and what they would expect of you.
It's once again that accountability, Amy. It's taken accountability. Yes, I've been using in here. I got some dirties. I did a parole packet for a guy, and they were talking about taking his date, but we worked it in, and he asked for inside treatment and then to go to sober living. And he got his first date because he had a plan. Though he was still using, had just got a dirty before the parole hearing. We made a plan together, and he took that to the parole board and he got his date. So I think it's about you taking accountability and being able to, once accountability is the biggest thing with parole board, your violations, your crime, whatever you're doing, if you can be accountable for it, they'll work with you on that.
That's great. Thank you for adding that. Victoria, do you have anything else to add about sort of the issue of substance use and reentry?
I do think that it's just worth saying that is a big thing to discuss in your reentry plan. If you have something, if you're going to talk about, you should have identified resources in your community where you'd like to go that will support you. And no matter how small of a community you come from, there are drugs in that community, and there's probably a facility to help people deal with that problem. So I will say there's lots of facilities to help with that. And I would just be sure to look into what you need to do that. See if you can find a sober living community. I know there's a lot of good sober living communities that will support people in reentry efforts all over Missouri and rural areas too. And so I think really trying to think about surrounding yourself with people who understand what you want to do and thinking about how your support system can help you and thinking about those aspects, because it is a journey and recovery is not a one-way road. There's loops and there's bumps, and we need to know who's going to help you when you need redirection on the path. So it's really important to identify those things. And with your history, how much help and support you need. If it's a frequent person that needs help, it's happened many times, then you need to really lay into that when you're describing how you're going to plan for the community. Versus if you've had 6 sober years, you're probably a little stronger in your ability to stay sober.
Thank you. I'm going to try to address the last question here, and then a question that we get often, and Victoria, I know you do too, about whether it makes sense to hire a lawyer. But the question in the chat or in the Q&A was about the parole packet, and whether that's going to be available time and time again. And my understanding is yes, that's all in their parole file and can be, accessed 5-10 years down the road. But I would suggest still updating it if you can with more recent letters of support. Of course, certificates or the like should be captured by the institutional parole officer in the pre-hearing report. But those materials are retained and should still be accessible to the board at the hearing.
Are you referring to like if somebody is going for a second or a subsequent hearing? Yes. So all information is actually retained indefinitely.
Right.
And since it went digitally, and even prior to going digital, the state still has archives. So I can speak for myself. I know that I had conducted a pre-hearing report with an individual who had been incarcerated actually in the 60s. So I had to request the archives to get the full paper copies,
Wow.
and those were pulled in. And so everything prior, even, I mean, they can see institutional conduct from back then, that is all pulled in. And it's not necessarily weighed during the current hearing, but it is shown as part of the criminal history. Has an individual been in prison before? Did they have any what they consider violent conduct violations during a prior incarceration? So anything at any point, it's retained indefinitely.
Great. That's good to know. The last question that we've got, because I know we're at time, but I want to make sure to cover, is whether people should prioritize hiring an attorney for a parole hearing. And like, how do you know if you should get an attorney? What's the benefit of doing that? And I'm happy to sort of jump in on that. And then other folks should as well. I do not think you need an attorney. I do not think every person needs an attorney to prepare for their parole hearing. I do think that there are instances where it's helpful. And I think one of the benefits that we provide is putting together what we call a parole packet, which might have mitigating information about our client's social history, their childhood. We can gather records. That's often really hard when you're locked up. And we can, put together kind of a pretty package to talk about who this individual is as a person, more than just a crime or a DOC number, and give them advice as to how to prepare, how to navigate the hearing, that kind of thing. And I think that's really helpful. I also, think that is something that non-attorneys can provide. And it just takes someone who, knows how to do some writing, pull stuff together, is organized. You don't have to be a lawyer to do that. And I'll say that there are some instances where I think having a lawyer in the room, look, for some reason, people don't necessarily like lawyers. I don't know why. I mean, I don't like most of them, but except the ones I work with. But people get a little bit on edge, right? Because suddenly like the stakes are a little higher, or, they're getting prepared for a fight. And so a lot of times I tell my client, like, you might not want me as your delegate. You get one person there. You probably want it to be your mom or your fiance, and I'm happy to be that person. But, the parole board, they really want that person to be a support person upon release. And so that might be me. And sometimes it is, but it might more appropriately be somebody else. And it's going to be up to that person as to who they're most comfortable with and who they want to be there. One notable exception I'll say is if the person has a disability that impedes their ability to navigate the process. So if they have an intellectual disability or a learning disability, having somebody, it doesn't have to be an attorney, but somebody who can help them, understand and navigate the process, I think is really important. And so if you have a loved one going up who has that sort of obstacle, feel free to reach out to us. I'm happy to help give some advice about who might be an appropriate person to have as a delegate. We've had in the past some success getting our presence there as an accommodation, so that we could make sure our client understood the questions being asked of them during the hearing. But otherwise, you don't need to hire a lawyer, and lawyers are expensive. And for some of what we do, pretty much anyone else, a college student could do for real. And I would love that. But especially other folks on this hearing who are, just as qualified as I am to put these parole packets together and do a beautiful job. Or even, your sister could do it if they've got a computer. There are no like magic words, there's no magic process to it. It's really what we look at it as is, telling a story of who this person is, and helping them form a reentry plan, because we know that that is such a big part of their success. And further in the chat, I shared 3 files, 2 templates for letters of support that delegates might provide. And then another is a sort of guidance on how to prepare for a hearing as a delegate. So folks feel free to download those and use those in the future. You can also always reach out to our office at the MacArthur Justice Center with any questions, or we have self-help guides for parole that we would be happy to send to you or a loved one. But I know we're a resource, and Sheena is a huge resource. And then her contact information is in the chat, as well as Victoria's, the transitions email address for SLU Otis's program. Any last words of wisdom from our panelists before we wrap things up?
I would just like to add that it's just as important for the family, if you cannot go to the parole hearing, to absolutely write a letter of how you're supporting your loved one. If you cannot make it, and make sure that it gets there a few weeks prior, and even if you have to certify it. Years ago, I would not get no response. And as prep for release, we do parole packets, and we actually get letters back from the parole board that says we got the packet, we got the support letters. So that has been a first for years. So I will have to say that. And like people to know that, the parole hearing is just as nerve-wracking for a family member too. And it's okay that you have support and ask people to help you navigate that.
And I would always encourage every individual who was sitting outside the room getting ready for their hearing is as easy as it is for me to say, just take deep breaths and relax. It's a test of them facing a fear, and they shouldn't be afraid, because on the other side of that door, there are human beings who really are trying to support with making the best decision possible for you to move forward with your life, and not seeing you as this is the offense that you're in here for, but seeing you as a human being. And I agree with Tony. You look forward to seeing how this individual has grown, just in evolving into sometimes almost a completely different human being. And if you're taking accountability for yourself and you have the support of your family and your friends, or even spiritual leaders, you've won half the battle.
Well, I am so grateful. I was so excited to put this panel together, because what like a fantastic group of folks who have expertise in all different sort of parts of the process. So I hope it was really helpful for everyone who attended. This recording will be on MacArthur Justice Center's YouTube site, so feel free to share it with your loved ones or other folks who may have missed the broadcast. Feel free to reach out to any of us in the contact information we shared in the chat. And stay tuned for future programming about navigating community supervision. Again, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to folks who took the time out of your evening to join us, and wish you all the best.